Hello and welcome to Fork in the Road. My name is Rusty Gaylord. I am the host. Very happy to have you with us here today. Fork in the Road is a conversation with business leaders, trailblazers, innovative thought leaders who are doing great work in the world and will share a little bit of their own experience, the forks in the road, the twists and turns that got them to where they are today. And then we'll expand the conversation to talk about leadership. What are some of the lessons they take from their own experience and they've gained along the way to share? So I am very excited to have today Sandra Sokoloff. She's joining us from New York. She is in the PR space and communications area of A&M, which is Alvarez and Marsal Professional Services Organization, and looking forward to getting into our conversation with Sandra. So welcome, Sandra.
Hello, so nice to be with you.
Great. Well, so let's jump in. One of the forks in the road that we were just chatting about a minute ago is that you recently wrote a children's picture book.
I did.
And I think what's so interesting about that is you're finding that this thing that seems totally unrelated to your work in a way has a lot of connections back to your work. And so it's not exactly a fork in the road, like you're changing direction, but there's a branch and you're going down two paths in parallel and you're finding all of these connections between them. I'd love to hear you share a little bit about it.
I did do this and I'm very excited to talk about it. I think sometimes these branches, as you've just identified, come about very organically and they take us by surprise, but they've been there all along. In my case, I have a step granddaughter who turned 5, living in London. And obviously, we haven't been able to see her as much as we used to with COVID. And I wanted to do something special for her 5th birthday. And an idea came to me, and I wrote a children's picture book for her. And I had so much fun doing it, and I loved seeing her reaction to it. And my partner, he's a professional writer, and he said, this is really good. You should show this around a little bit. So I'm in process. We have some friends in London who are in the publishing world, and I'm in process of getting feedback and shopping it around. But I've learned so much from this experience that has been so informative, both professionally and personally. Professionally, it's really shown me I can write in a whole different genre. Anybody who's been in PR and comms and marketing like I have for many, many years, you get very used to writing, whether it's for business presentations, whether it's marketing collateral, whether it's a press release, and that you really think of that as your craft, and it is your craft. But this has shown me I can look at storytelling in a whole new way. I can look at narrative in a whole new way. I can express myself to a very different audience, a child, as opposed to a target buyer. So that's been very exciting. And it also personally has opened up a whole new level of creativity for me, which also is interesting to apply on the career front as well.
I'm curious, because oftentimes when you think you've got a long career, I mean, you started as a journalist way back, at the beginning of your career, but you've worked in PR at agencies and now you're doing this in A&M. And yet, so in some respects, you've been a writer, and yet this is a totally different form of writing. And I'm wondering if there was any barrier to you or question of, can I do this? Is this something I'm capable of? Because it's so easy to classify ourselves as this or that.
It's so easy to classify ourselves. And sometimes the thought, I think, of trying something new, it can just bog you down. I've had people in the past say to me, oh, you should write a book on this, or you'd be great to write a book on that. And I thought, oh, a book, it'll be endless. Where would I find the time? Do I really want to do that? But this was just such an organic, natural happening. And it clicked for me. And it was such a different kind of departure that it didn't feel like an effort. It didn't feel like work. It felt very, very joyous. And we were talking about earlier that this whole idea that, that does it always have to be a binary choice? If I take the left path for the fork in the road versus the right path for the fork in the road, can I ever get back on the other track? And I've come to learn through this experience and several others in my career that I really believe there can be parallel tracks, and we can build footbridges between those tracks and kind of leverage what we learned from each and apply it to the other.
Yeah. In fact, I think most of the time we think that there's a binary choice. We're
Yes.
really limiting ourselves. We're limiting ourselves to think that it has to be either A or B, when in fact it's way more rewarding on many fronts to be thinking about how can it be A and B, or the best
I
elements of A and B.
I agree. And sometimes, we like A and we like B. And how do we choose?
Right.
You know,
Both. Both.
both. And so one of the things I've always tried to do, and I've counseled people who have worked with me and people who I've mentored, how do you take these things and combine them in your own unique way? One of the things I like to do is almost think like a Venn diagram,
Mhm.
where if you think of one circle, what am I really passionate about? What do I really love to do? What am I good at? The next circle might be, what would I like to learn? What don't I know that could be helpful? And the third circle might be, what's out there in the universe that the world needs? And I think when you find that radical center, it can be a very interesting place to operate from.
Absolutely. Um, yeah. So, one of the things I think is interesting is this, this. I was actually thinking about a different kind of Venn diagram when you were describing that. Like, to
Mhm.
me, I was thinking about this Venn diagram of what do I do at work and what am I interested in personally. And I heard that overlap happen with you as you wrote this children book, which started off as a personal thing, but then you're finding all of these connections that actually does overlap with your work in the way you think about storytelling and the way you think about visual images and not just text. And you think about your creativity and bringing your creativity to work. And as someone who spent the first 25 years of my career in the corporate world, I thought those circles didn't touch at all. I thought like work was over here, personal life was over here, and they don't ever intersect, because I tried to be that put the corporate
Right.
persona on and show up in that way. And I'm curious, as you've been in this space for the last period of time, number of months or years, kind of experimenting and seeing the connection points between this children's picture book that you wrote and your work, which is largely around communication, and you're seeing the connections between them. I'm wondering if you have a thought on, for other people who are listening, how do you blend and bring together some of who you are as a person with how you show up at work, so there's less of a barrier, the way I
Yeah.
described, and you start to see more overlap?
Yeah. I think part of that comes, I would say the first part stems from really having a good sense of self.
Hmm.
Who are you? What do you want to project? What are your interests? How do those relate to the area where you're working, the company, the organization, the other people, your team? So I think starting from that, I think a good sense of self. And then I think it's being open to sharing ideas and to building relationships internally in the organization, externally within your industry, friendships that allow you to share ideas and to get feedback and to test concepts, and not to be afraid to raise your hand and to say, "Hey, I have this idea. I'd love to chat with you about it," or "I thought of this. Have you ever thought of that?" I think part of it is when you know yourself and you see where your interests are, and then you can connect what other people are talking about, what the needs of the organization are, and making the contact, starting the dialogue to
Mhm.
bring forth those ideas, and having the understanding that not every idea will generate a home run. Not every idea may work, and that's okay. To me, I've always said to my teams, to the people I'm working with, pitch me. If we don't take the idea, that's okay. It'll spark something else. It
Mhm.
may be the right idea 6 months from now. I think sometimes we get so caught up in our own minds of, oh, it won't be the right thing. I'll raise my hand at the meeting and it won't turn out well, or I haven't thought it through to the nth degree. And I'm always a believer in preparation, but I'm also a believer in raising your hand.
Yeah.
I like to tell myself sometimes, you never heard no before. We've all heard no. We've all heard no. No doesn't mean it's the end. No means not now. Yes.
Hmm.
So I think
Yeah.
there's some of that.
I like those steps that you outlined. Knowing yourself and then being willing to share in conversation with others and learn from them and connect with them, and raise your hand to ask for that kind of connection.
Yes.
And the doing your homework is the first part of that. It's the knowing yourself. What are you interested in? What do you want to talk about? But then it's a willingness to raise your hand and actually find people that you can talk about your ideas, about who you are, and like how that can impact your work.
Right. I mean, and I think part of that comes from building relationships along the way.
Mhm.
Um, not every conversation has to be about the upcoming project. I'm very fortunate to work with so many wonderful, interesting people here at Alvarez and Marsal, and to have relationships with them where I ask them how their daughter's doing in college, or how was their vacation, or I share the fact that we're visiting the family in London, and here's a great restaurant I tried. Those little water cooler, if you will, for an old-fashioned term, and I realize it's harder now since COVID to do that with a lot of hybrid work or working remotely, even though you can still do that online. But I think those types of interactions are really critical. Those are the interactions that build you the base of stakeholders where you're working, that allow you to share an idea, that allow you to get feedback. You know these people, they know you.
So I'm curious about this. Clearly having a personal relationship with someone just makes a huge difference. More challenging to do virtually. We acknowledge that. How does that, do you think, fits into this idea of a personal brand?
Oh, I think they're connected. I definitely do. And I think the word personal brand can get used in a lot of different ways.
Hmm.
When I think of it, I think about, what are you communicating internally to your internal audience, whether that's your boss, your team, your colleagues in the next department, and what are you communicating externally, and how does that represent who you are and what you think? How are you putting forth ideas, whether it's raising your hand in the meeting, whether it is opining or posting something on your social media that has meaning to you, that you think has implications that you'd like to talk about.
Mhm.
So I think they go hand in hand. I think having the personal relationships helps give you the base, the personal branding. You can amplifies through the personal relationships and vice versa.
Yeah. One of the things I think is so interesting there is when you talked about personal brand, you talked about the way you communicate, which is not just the things you post on social media, that kind of thing. I think a lot of us think about personal brand in that way. What picture are we painting to those people who are seeing us? But equally important is when you raise your hand in a meeting. Are you raising your hand in a meeting? What are you sharing when you're doing that? How are you sharing it? And I think, I hadn't really thought about it this way, but of course, every interaction you have is contributing to your personal brand.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think that's where I fall back on knowing yourself and being
Mhm.
prepared.
Yeah.
Um, Even the most mundane meeting or mundane encounter can take you to the next level, can give you an idea, can spark a conversation. Very simple steps. Have you looked at everybody's profile who's going to be in the meeting if you don't know them? Have you looked at the agenda? Or are you just going in there and winging it? Is there something that you can raise that will contribute to the level of the conversation? Highlight a colleague, what they've done, build upon a concept. It's not to say you have to do this in every single meeting and every single interaction, but I think that way of thinking can really help showcase who you are on the workplace, as well as through other things that you might be involved with, whether those are charitable organizations or boards that you sit on. I find that when I prepare like that and when I think like that, it gives me the that maybe sometimes that extra level of confidence or that extra level of security to raise my hand.
Yeah. I'm one of the things that you mentioned earlier that came out of your experience of writing this children's picture book is creativity and tapping into creativity in a new way. And some of what you're describing is, there could be a creative element to it, but it's like, do your homework, right? Be prepared, know what's going to be covered, know who's in the meeting, be willing to step up, add value. Those are pretty standard kind of like, well, yeah, if you want to be successful in the business world, those things all make sense. I'm curious about the creativity piece. And the reason I ask is I've worked with people in the past who are quite creative, but they tone that down in the business environment because they say, well, I'm not sure if it's going to be welcome in an environment where people are wearing suits and it's a little bit more goal oriented and results driven, that kind of thing. And so they're just hesitant. Can I be creative? And I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that relative to who you are as a person, right?
Well, I think, yeah, I mean, creative is a big word, right? It's a very broad word and means a lot in different contexts and different environments. And I hear you. And I think that's a very legitimate question and also a very legitimate concern that people face. Mm-hmm. Somebody recently asked me, was it hard to go from the agency world where you worked on, big iconic brands and launches of consumer products and, those types of issues to what I'm doing now. And my response was, I'm using my creativity in a very different way. And I think when you think about creativity from the real corporate in the boardroom, making those kinds of decisions, seat or platform, if you will, I think about, the question I always ask myself is, does this creative idea advance the goals of the organization? Whether those are revenue goals or business development goals or stakeholder management goals, whatever the goals are, whatever you're working on, whether it's technical, whether it's in IT, whether it's compliance, whatever it is, I think there's a lot of room for creativity. I think the question is, does it advance the organization and the goals? It's very exciting sometimes to be creative for creative sake. And that's a lot of fun. And it's a great way to kind of flex your muscle and hone that skill. But I always put myself through that lens. Does this creative idea, no matter how fun and sexy and dramatic it is, if it doesn't move the needle or help support move the needle to achieve the goal, then that's nice. And I had a nice time thinking of a fun, creative idea, but I may not bring that up.
Yeah. The idea of being goal-oriented, clearly important for anything you're contributing in the business. But if we bring that back to the idea of a personal brand, how important do you think it is for people to actually figure out what is the goal of their personal brand? Who do they want to be, right? Clearly there's some self-knowledge that's required there, but is it important to articulate these are the attributes or the characteristics, or this is the way I want to be seen, or to let that evolve more organically?
I don't, again, the binary choices, right? I'm not sure there's a one way or a right or a wrong way. I think a lot of it is how you're wired. I think for some people, articulating that out, this is how I want to be seen, this is my goal, this is what I want to do, that works really well. It gives them a format, it gives them a structure. Mm-hmm. I think for other people, it may be more fluid and organic. They have a tremendous experience and they want to write about that. And they see a connection between the recent exhibit that they saw at the Met and an issue that they're working on at work. So I don't think there's a right or wrong. And if I had to characterize myself, I probably have a little bit of both. I'm a person who needs some of that structure and timelines and thinking about it and having a plan. But I also know that some of the best things happen in terms of when I think about what I want to convey or a new thing I want to try is when I let life in and I let life happen.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm 100% with you on that. One of the comments you made earlier I thought was interesting is, in these days, visual communication is increasingly important, right? Mm-hmm. When we think about short form video, TikTok,
right?
Even most social media, it's images, it's pictures. How do you think about that relative to the professional world, right? As someone who is a communication expert, right? I'm sure you've done a lot of writing in your career. How does visual start to take a bigger role in the professional world?
Well, I think that's really, it's been evolving for quite some time. I mean, if you look at how the professional world communicates on LinkedIn, the social banner, what does that image look like? What does the font look like? What is it? Are we using a graphic? Are we using a photo? I mean, all of that has been emerging for some time. You see a lot of work now being done with video. And not just video of a straight interview, but interspersing content or other pieces of content, graphics. You've seen that emerge quite a lot with infographics. So this has been an ongoing thing. I think if anything, for me personally, it opens up how I think about communicating. If you would ask me 20 years ago, or 25, if I'm dating myself here, what would be the best way to get a leader's insight out into the market? I would have said an interview, a byline article, being on television, the very standard things. Today, the field it's a wide, there's a plethora of great choices. The best way to get a leader's insight out into the market might be a podcast. It might be an infographic. It might be a short video that gets distributed to a select email list of potential clients. I mean, there's such a variety of tools that I think it enhances your communication and your storytelling ability. It gives you so many more options that have a variety of benefits to them.
Yeah, I guess, when I'm reflecting on this conversation, I guess the theme that keeps coming back for me is this idea of bringing more of yourself and knowing yourself and bringing yourself, finding your interests, being willing to express that in a positive and creative way, finding the right avenue that allows you to express that, right? Whether it's a podcast or some other kind of format. But it's about kind of different from what I described earlier, right? There was work and then there's my personal life, and those two things don't ever intersect. It's more and more the blending of that is becoming more and more who you are and showing up as who you are at work.
I think it's about knowing yourself. I think it's about knowing also a little bit of legacy here. What's the goal? What do you want to create? What do you want to leave behind? What do you want to make different, make better? So I think it's that, and I also think it's about understanding how you want to convey your story.
Yeah. Wow. I think those are great. We could spend another 30 minutes unpacking each one of those things.
I know. They're very powerful, but we hear a lot today throughout the media about storytelling and telling your story, and organizations telling their story. And I think there's something very powerful about thinking about what your story is. And what does it mean? How have you gotten to where you are? What are the paths you're thinking about? How do they intersect? And going back to the first part of our conversation.
Yeah. Well, and I think that's so useful because we can get so short-term oriented, right? Like, what do I want to do in the next 6 months, in the next year, even in the next 2 or 3 years? But when you zoom out into, well, I've got a 30-year career or longer for some people. What is the story of my career?
What is the story? Yeah. And what do I want to, make? How do I want to make that mark? Yeah. I also think sometimes these words can be intimidating or overwhelming to people. Oh my God, I don't know my story or my mark, But I think it's really thinking about, how could I make this better? How could I change this? How could I help the team be better? How could I help this process be better? Those are things we think and we talk about all the time in our professional lives, whatever capacity we're working in. And we have great opportunities often to make small marks that add up into interesting change.
Yeah. That is a wonderful place to wrap this up, Sandra. Thank you so much. If people want to reach out to you, what's the best way to do that?
You can find me on LinkedIn. I would love to hear from you and happy to respond.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for joining here today, Sandra.